All right, should we give it a minute or two for other folks to join and then get started?
Yeah, I suggest giving 1 minute.
For fun. Do you know if Quinn would be joining?
Yeah, college he's supposed to join. That's what I am looking for, actually. If he doesn't join in next minute or so, we'll start.
Yeah.
Bless you.
Yeah, I guess we can start. And Torin, do you want to start by suggesting what you were talking the last time, or Maru, you can also drive the conversation today?
I think for me, it might be helpful to just sort of frame the conversation. I'd kind of been assuming, maybe incorrectly, that the way that we wanted policy to work was kind of as it was simplistically defined in the current Federation V1, which is they have the mission controller that can apply admin policy to a given resource and communicates that the result of that decision via an annotation indicating placement, for example. So I think it would be helpful to level set and make sure what would an ideal policy implementation for a federation look like? Is it just placement? Is there something else? Does that make sense? At least as a starting point. Probably I'm asking you that, Tori.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment was specifically around placement that I left in the doc, but obviously things like authorization come into play. both authorization at the federation level, as well as like propagation, or whatever you want to say, federation of like authorization in the underlying clusters. But I feel like those are maybe big topics, and we don't want to necessarily try to bite them all off at once, unless folks feel strongly about that. So I'd be happy to just keep this conversation around placement policy, but it's sort of up to you guys, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of mixed on that, I must be honest. I think that this, what's the right word, authorization, authentication issue in the context of controllers in general acting on behalf of some party keeps rearing its head and keeps kind of derailing conversations. So I guess we can punt it for now, but we're going to have to figure out our position on it sooner rather than later, I think. But maybe we put it aside for now and just make note of all of the problems that the current system creates, and then we can perhaps attack those holistically at some point soon.
Is there a doc or anything on those like describing the problems with like what I'll call security policies? Is that something that that exists today that I could catch up on?
I don't know whether such a doc exists. The form in which I know of the problem is basically that the user with its token, his or her token, comes in through the front end and creates something usually. And then quite often there are automated components that then execute that thing. But the automated components do not actually act as that user, they act as basically super user. And to make things even worse, they don't even necessarily always know who they're acting on behalf of. So there's kind of this assumption that the admission controller, when the user creates the thing, whatever it is, makes sure that all of the consequences of creating that thing are kind of allowed, and then the controllers assume they can just do whatever they're told to do without checking anything. That's my understanding of the problem. And I can envisage, namespaces to some extent resolve this, because as long as the damage is limited to a namespace, and that can sort of mitigate the problem, but it doesn't seem to actually solve the problem. Be interesting. I don't know if there's anyone here who's from like SIG-Auth or something who has a tighter handle on what's going on in that conversation. Just seems to kind of keep coming up and not get resolved.
I would be hesitant to want to pursue that discussion here, not because it's not important, because as you say, it clearly is. But I think it's such a cross-cutting concern, and I'd really like to make progress in this API.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe we should bring it up with SIG-Auth and say, look, what's the situation? What's the plan? And then we can use that as a kickoff point to say, well, if this is the plan, these are the ways in which the plan does or does not work for our use cases. How's that sound?
Sounds reasonable.
Sounds good. Sounds like everybody's in agreement that we should just stick to placement today. So, yep. Good.
So I think where we left off on Wednesday was the existing model of applying an annotation per resource isn't really supported by the proposal to have placement via selector. And the question that like just Torrin raising that brought in my mind was, okay, if I'm an admission controller, I'm looking at a resource, I'm considering the policy that applies to that resource. Where do I put the policy decision? Like, if there's a placement resource somewhere that's applied via selector, and there's potentially multiple of them, but I have to somehow execute all the placement selectors to find which apply to which resource. It kind of suggested to me that there needs to be two places to do placement. Either that, or we just pick the resource and we just do it the way it is today, or the resource will have like a placement field, and it could be selector based or whatever. And then there's sort of the ability to have a separate placement resource, so you can apply placement There has to be some sort of way of resolving if they both define placement. Does that make sense?
I must be honest, I don't fully understand the problem.
Okay.
So if I can paraphrase you, so there's a potential problem with multiple placement directives and somehow merging them in some sensible fashion. And that's the only one I understand so far, I guess.
Okay, I'll step back. So the way that Federation V1 was defining placement, it was via an annotation, it was per resource. So if the admission controller wanted to know where to put a placement decision, it was on the resource. There's no ambiguity about that.
Okay, gotcha.
As soon as we have a separate placement resource, and potentially multiple of them, and they're applied via selector, then how does the admission controller figure out where to put that placement decision? Does that problem make more sense?
Yes, now I understand.
Okay.
I guess
So-
one more.
Go ahead.
I guess one more point which also needs to be paraphrased in the same problem statement is that admission controller might not be the only entity which might implement the placement, because the placement decision might change later, and because, for example, by scheduling or some other entity which is external.
Yeah, so just to echo what Irfan said, maybe there's a component that's responsible for remediation, right? Or reconciliation if different policy changes. And so you'd want to be able to at least have visibility into what workloads need to be moved, but maybe you want to go a step further and have them moved automatically, for example. And so you'd want to at least have that logic factored out of the admission controller so that it could be reused by like that kind of like remediation engine.
I wasn't trying to preclude different mechanisms setting it. It's more like if some, I'm giving you a concrete example, but it's really like, I need to make a placement decision on this resource. Where do I put that decision? And so whoever's making it, whenever they're making it, there has to be a way of discovering where, if it's not on the resource itself. And I guess I don't see there being a good way to make that work with a selector-based placement resource. Go ahead.
Do we have a shared set of use cases that we think that policy should be able to give us, like in this facet, so that we're all on the same page about what it's supposed to do? Forget about implementation.
In the original, I'm not sure if anyone's written the detail up recently, but in the original Federation proposal that I wrote many years ago, there is an enumeration of these kinds of things, the reasons why placement decisions would be made and the basis on which they would be made. And that might form a reasonable starting point for this thing. So for example, make sure it goes in the cheapest place, make sure that it goes in a compliant place where compliance might imply FICA compliance or credit card processing compliance regulations, etc. Might apply to proximity to internal things or external things, etc.
Like availability and so on, like it's a high criticality application.
Yeah, is another one.
Yeah.
Don't make it not fail when this other thing fails.
Yep.
So there's a kind of a dividing line I guess we have to be careful of, and I'm going to just say what I've sort of been using as the dividing line and see if there's any consensus on that. So there's what the application deployer wants and can express those sets of requirements, which typically encompass things like HA and application behavior. And then there is stuff that is imposed upon the application deployer by some other group. And often that is a corporate policy group or something like that. And they're the ones who say, we preferentially put stuff on premise until we run out of capacity and then we go outside. Or we ensure that all PCI jobs must be in the PCI compliant data center. So these are things that are typically imposed upon the application deployer. I don't know if there's a...
Yeah, and those make sense to me. I just wondered if we had like a list of them somewhere. It doesn't have to be recent. Like, I think that would be very useful if we could dig up a link to the original one. That's all.
Yeah, I can do that. As an aside, that document, I actually looked for it the other day and it's gone from the repo. Somehow it disappeared in the migration of various documents around. And I found it in a fork of our original repo in somebody else's GitHub account. So we can go and pull it back out of there. But yeah, I don't know if anybody know where it went or why it went there.
Okay. Do you have a link to it handy now?
I just posted a link.
Oh,
in the
okay.
chat. I didn't mean to include that fragment that goes directly to policy engines, but I think that's the one that
Okay.
it's referring to. Quentin can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that looks like the one. Oh, so it is actually in the community repo.
Maybe, but it's at a, I don't know if that commit. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, but that is the one I was talking about. Yes.
And I got to that by looking for the placement proposal that we wrote up last time around. So I can post a link to that as well, just in case people are curious about how we came up with the current implementation.
Cool.
It occurs to me that, I mean, my thinking about having placement be applied per resource, maybe admin policy, if you're only making placement decisions based on placement resources, then maybe the admission controller would simply target the placement rather than the resources. And that's like, okay, you have a selector, I want to target all applications in some place. And then you'd have, a set of clusters, be a selector or direct object reference. I mean, what about having an admission controller or some other mechanism like managing placement resources instead of actually manipulating resources directly? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that could work. It raises questions in my mind about how you make dynamic placement decisions, though. Like, so if the placement decision that if you're trying to enforce a placement decision that's a function of like the incoming workload or the incoming resource, how do you do that? It would be you'd have to probably create these placement objects on the fly. I would imagine. So I guess there's some we would need to like work through that, but in my mind that sounds a little bit scary.
How did that originally work in the existing federation? So
today in Federation 1.0 or whatever we're calling it, there's an admission controller that can be configured to call out to an HTTP endpoint, and so it's totally decoupled from the policy engine that implements the placement policy. So it executes basically a webhook call, and then it gets back a set of annotations or patches to apply to the resource that's being created.
Yeah, but I mean
so
the
then,
dynamic behaviors that you referred to.
Oh, sure. So I mean that's up to the policy engine, right? So like in the case of OPA, we basically supply the full extent of the resource being created. So if it's a replica set, you get the entire replica set object as input to the policy. And then the rules that the policy engine uses to make the placement decision can evaluate over that input, that replica set, for example.
Yeah, that's not quite what I'm asking. So like what you just said that you weren't sure about implementing in the context of something that works on placement objects is if you have a controller that has to reconcile with the current state of the world as determined by some measurements it can take and reprogram the placement for something. And I wanted to understand, is that something that Federation and policy integration do today, or is that a future use case that you weren't?
Yeah, I can talk to that perhaps. I think I understand what you're asking, Paul. So let's for the moment just ignore policy, and just I think it'd be useful for everyone just to have a common understanding of how, like a replica set controller puts things into clusters at the moment. So it receives an API object, a replica set, which may or may not have annotations. Those annotations can specify either very specific placement requirements, for example, put this in cluster A or put this in cluster B, or it can receive less specific things like put this stuff in European clusters or put this stuff in PCI compliant clusters. And if it receives the latter kind, it then goes and does what it needs to do and places them by whatever hard-coded algorithm it might have, just matching labels, etc. If it receives the more vague kind, then it finds out what the current status of the world is and compares that with the desired status, and then essentially does whatever changes need to be made. So if there is a cluster in a US region and, or rather a piece of the replica set in a US region, and the requirements state that it must only be in EU regions, it will remove it from the US region, place it in the EU region.
And like when it does that, this is decoupled from any like add or update event that is resulting in the admission controller running. Is that right?
Correct. So,
okay.
So the admission controller is not required for any of this stuff. What the admission controller allows is to have explicit configurable policy that would determine how that happens. And the way that it's implemented today is that it does this evaluation at admission control time and then essentially overwrites the annotations on the object based on the outcome of the policy decision. And that way, the controller doesn't need to make hard-coded, unconfigurable decisions about where to put things. It just puts them wherever the policy admission controller told it to by virtue of the annotations that it provided.
Okay, so I think I might be missing something about your concern, Torin, but I would say that like, say that we have a policy integration with an API that programs via admission control, like mutates the spec for a placement object. If we need to make those behaviors something that like, there's a controller that's actually reprogramming placement based on policy, we could always have another controller that reprograms the, that updates the placement API itself. Does that make sense?
I think that what you're saying and what the current proposal suggests could be made to work. It seems kind of complicated to require basically like dynamic creation of placement resources to control placement of individual resources, whereas today you simply specify like the placement directly on the resource. It's unclear why.
Why would it be necessary to specify an individual resource if the resources were going to be propagated in a group anyway? So if I have application with the replica set, a secret, and they have a placement resource that selects them based on label like app equals foo or whatever, and then the placement decision would be done en masse. Like it'd be applied to that one placement resource, says select only these clusters. Like, does that? I guess I'm having trouble understanding why that wouldn't work, but I get like your concern of dynamically creating them. In what case would you need to dynamically create placement resources? In the case where like they don't exist
I would
already?
assume that every workload that comes in would need basically, like if you're doing this with policy, I would assume that like every resource that comes in, you'd either pick an existing one or you'd have to create a new one, right? You'd have to pick an existing placement resource or you'd have to create a new one, right?
Right.
So that you need to have some way to determine whether you should do that.
Like, how do you find the placement resource, I guess is the question.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, that would certainly be part of it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the new API looks like. So you're just saying that like the new API is that you have like a collection of resources being created or updated, and you want to, and then you would just create a new place. You would just like there'd be another resource on the side that is the placement resource.
Yeah. And I mean,
just to interject here for a moment. So I think, Maru, what you're saying is that typically these things would be created at approximately the same time, and therefore they could be sort of viewed as all or nothing. But the API doesn't actually provide that. The API says you can create these things in any order, and when any one of them arrives, any of the other ones may be missing or not updated yet or whatever.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that there's some dependency on time of creation. I guess the model in my head, whether it makes sense or not, would be that there would be like a default placement resource, maybe per namespace. It would be like, send all the things to all the clusters. And so any resource you create in that namespace would automatically get that propagation, that placement resource associated with it. And if there needed to be more specific behavior, you would create a new placement resource that specifically selected like just this subset. Or you would modify the existing one or whatever. And the goal of like, when you're applying policy, you wouldn't even consider the resources. You just consider the placement resource. You're saying, given these characteristics or these like that are being selected for, like you'd have to be able to parse the resource selector. Given these resources, what placement policy should be applied, and then construct the appropriate like cluster selector or list of clusters or however. Does that make sense? I'm not saying this doesn't impose like a burden, because then you either, if you want to provide specific placement for specific resources, you have to start creating these resources. You don't just get it as part of the resource. I don't know whether that's worth it or not. This is just kind of like proposing a way that it could be done. Feel free to poke holes or ask questions where I'm being completely unclear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this goes back. Like, I think Paul was kind of asking this initially, which is like, what are the use cases here that we're trying to solve? And I guess like if the big one is that you want to be able to supply or provide per namespace control over placement, then
not just per namespace. Like, I'm just saying that's kind of the.
Well, it seems like that's what the current one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that seems like what the current proposal is targeted at. It doesn't deal with like cluster, or like cluster scope or whatever you want, federation scope placement so much. It doesn't really talk about how you have like how you resolve conflicts and so on, or at least you'd have to pick something and so on. So
you mean conflicts in terms of having multiple placement?
Yeah, multiple. If you have multiple applicable placement resources, how do you union these clusters? Do you intersect them? Do you return an error?
So I guess one thing that is dancing around in my brain over here is that there's probably like two different views of this, and I'm not sure if I've been thinking about them correctly. So I think one of them is where a user, and this is probably the way that I was thinking about this last week, where in mental model 1, like you might have a placement resource, and user would create that resource. So the user might create a placement resource that says this replica set goes into clusters X, Y, and Z. And policy, thinking about it as like an emission controller, would say, sorry, user, it can't go into cluster C because that particular replica set has a label that means that it has to be only in environments that are compliant with this particular law. And only A and B are in there, so I reject this placement or reprogram the placement that you created to only have A and B in it. And that you like place or policy is basically checking your work and making sure that you're not doing something that you're not supposed to. And then there's another way to think about this where you might have the policy create the placement. And so the policy might say, take all the workloads that have like this label that means that they require this type of compliance and put them into only the clusters that are compliant with that thing. And so instead of the user having to say, put resource X in cluster A and B, that the policy might just watch all the resources and say, hey, there's a new one that I govern, and I'm going to say, okay, well, I'll make a placement that is the compliant placement with the policy that I know about. And I wonder if those make sense to people as like, do people understand what I'm trying to communicate about how those are different? And which flavor do we think we need, or do we need both? It sounds to me like there's kind of a mixture in the existing federation between both of these flavors.
Yeah, I think I can talk to that briefly and give my opinion, whatever that's worth. So I think we need at least the what I'll call the more complex flavor. So, and in fact, sort of the origin of federation idea was largely to solve these kind of problems. Is we should allow users to say, I need this thing in Europe, Asia, and North America. And at any point in time, whichever clusters are running, that should be true. And then the system to make sure that that was true. And then policy gets layered on top of that, and some other deciding entity says, this app is a financial app and it needs to go into FICA compliant or whatever the compliancy requirements are clusters. So it then essentially overlays that set of requirements, and the end result is you end up ideally with stuff in clusters which are both spread in the right continents and compliant with whatever the regulations are. Now, subsequent to that, I think there is a simpler requirement that's come out which says for users who only have 3 clusters, for example, and they just want to say, put this thing in my 3 clusters, A, B, and C. They want to be able to do that, and they don't want to have fancy controllers and things. They just want to propagate it in there and see it happen. And I would tentatively speculate or argue that trying to merge things like policy with that is maybe not the right thing to do. Because I think what you end up with is something that probably doesn't do what the user wants. If the user says, I want it in A, B, and C, but then there's a policy that says you can't put them in A, B, and C because of whatever the policy is, you probably just end up with a non-working application. And to have it working, you need to have some fairly sophisticated automation in the system that says, well, you said you want A, B, and C, but I'm going to put them in D and F because of policy. And then the user says, but what the hell? That's not what I wanted, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of end up going down that rabbit hole. And one solution to that problem might be to say, if you want A, B, and C, you just get it, and you don't, those flavors of clusters don't get policy and don't get anything more than being able to put stuff in A, B, and C. If you want policy and higher level control of where your stuff goes, because you don't want to have to keep track of, this month it's A, B, and C, and next month it's B, C, and D, and every month the app deployer has to go and decide where to put their stuff because the clusters have moved or changed or been turned down, then you go for the higher level stuff, and you give some additional control to the system, and it figures out where exactly to put your stuff based on what you told it, which is, I actually just want Europe, Asia, and North America.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting to think about.
I just put it
Okay.
out there as a potential way of thinking about the problem. I think it's tricky to try and like fulfill all of these requirements, some of which are kind of fundamentally contradictory.
Yeah, and that I think you're right, and that might be a place where there might be a couple different, where it might be useful to have different flavors of placement. Like maybe one is like does not have policy and is like what you write here will be done for you regardless of any policy that other people have configured, right? And so if you use the like the manual control policy or the manual control flavor of placement, maybe you just have to be very careful that you configure it to do the things that are compliant with the rules that you actually, like as a business, have to comply with. And at the other end of the spectrum, maybe there's something that you program at a higher level and say, put these workloads into the places where the policy says that they should go. And maybe that could generate the manual flavor and reconcile those, but you would not program those directly as a user.
Yeah. I guess the only caveat to that would be that you could have the explicit placement, I want A, B, and C, but you're explicitly giving up automated high availability because, if the policy says you can't do that, then your thing just doesn't work. Or if A, B, and C get turned down after you start your app, like your app doesn't run anymore. And there's no like fancy system that is going to make your app run because you're too specific about what you wanted. And all we can say is, no, you can't have that. Possibly at some point in the future.
Yeah. So I'm thinking back to the whiteboard drawing that I put into this document.
Which document is that?
The brainstorming one. I'm putting a link to it here. It's the whiteboard drawing that has the like template, placement, overrides, propagation related to one another. And in terms of like that drawing, I almost am seeing policy as like an alternative in the swim lanes or in the column that placement and overrides is in. That like maybe you specify placement or maybe you specify policy. And the outcome of like those, either one of those is something that can express where things should go in some way.
I think it's worth noting that the problem we just outlined is not actually specific to policy. It occurs, with availability as well. So if you said I want my stuff in A, B, and C, and there's just no resources in A, B, and C, you're screwed. And only if you give the system the ability to override your choice and put them in D and F because that's where there's capacity, do you get a working system. And the same applies to quota and other such things. So it's not, unless you view quota and availability as policy, but they're kind of, well, quota maybe, availability not.
Yeah. This is very interesting food for thought, and I'm probably going to need some time to digest it personally. All right, thanks for the background. That was very useful.
Well, actually, anybody else has thoughts on this?
I'm wondering now if there's like a middle ground here where you have this relatively simple per namespace placement object that it could exist and it would make it easy for people to control placement with a fairly like coarse-grained DSL. But then you also could have the ability to specify the placement or propagation, maybe is a better word for it, on the individual resources. And that's effectively what exists today, right? You can, on an individual resource, you can say it must go to exactly these clusters, or it must go to clusters with these labels through label select or through cluster selectors. And so maybe that's the middle ground. Like, you could imagine taking the per namespace placement objects and applying those, and then calling up to the policy engine and saying, okay, policy engine, hey, what are the final clusters that this resource should go to? And it would already have those per namespace ones applied, and then the policy engine could decide whether to like allow or deny that, or to mutate that, or whatever. But that would kind of give you maybe the best of both worlds.
I agree.
Or all three worlds, actually, because I guess there's like the manual, there's the manual explicit option where the users just supply that every time they create resources. There's the per namespace, simple DSL approach. That's which is sort of what's outlined in the proposal right now. And then there's like the full-blown policy approach that we have in V1 today. And maybe it's possible to provide all three of those in this.
I think one of the goals of having separate placement resources was being able to aggregate placement decisions across resources. But it doesn't, even though I was kind of trying to go through this mental exercise of like, how could I make that compatible with, more selective policy decisions? And it's like, it's just not. So
it's not mutually exclusive, is it? Or in your mind?
Well, I think it is, just because it's like, I was like, oh, you could have the policy engine applying to placement resources. But then I'm like, well, how are you going to do that? Even if there's, label selection going on, what if you're not defining a label that the underlying resources are defining the policy? Like, it just becomes really complicated. So, I mean, when I was originally thinking about this a really long time ago, it was like, well, we'll have both. And it kind of seems like we've gotten back to that requirement just on the basis of having to support policy. And I think Paul's point about having like a different flavor of placement, maybe one like that, just like, I guess for me, either having it being a direct field is one option, which would kind of mirror what Federation V1 does today. And I think that would be one way to do it. And another way would be to have a separate resource that was like directly related. And the only advantage of having a separate resource that was very like, it was per resource placement, not like per namespace or using a selector. The only advantage of that is then you could control it with something like RBAC, and you'd be able to prevent people from changing it who weren't allowed to change it. But you could equally, create an admission controller that would control things at the field level. So either way, my thinking is that we probably need something that applies to per resource, so policy can have a canonical place to put that decision. And then we need to be able to protect it via an admission controller or RBAC, which would influence like how it was implemented.
But there's I think we might be making it more complicated than it needs to be. So we have the set of requirements that the application administrator specifies, whatever their requirements are, which may be specific or generic. Specific example we've been using is cluster A, B, and C. Generic is like Europe or PCI compliant or whatever. Then we have the outcome of the placement decision by the system, which in the case of a specific cluster selection can either be, that set of clusters, or, maybe policy overrode it and said we decided not to put it anywhere because the request was not compliant with policy. Or in the more general case, the placement decides that it goes into particular clusters, but that's distinct from what the user asked us for. And I think is specific to particular resources. So it's entirely possible that a requirement could be, put this thing in European clusters, and a secret goes into some cluster, and there's no pods available in that cluster, so a replica set with the same requirement goes into a different cluster. Does that make sense?
and these aren't dependent resources?
Well, so then you have a separate requirement, which is that I want this secret to be in the same cluster as this replica set.
Right.
And that, I think, is a different constraint.
Right.
And then the schedulers for those two different things have to take into account that this thing's already in the other cluster, so I've got to put it there, or I have to fail, or I have to move the other thing to the same. So there's a proximity requirement.
So sorry, just to sideline, the proximity requirement to me suggests, like, do we even have that concept today?
No, because it's per resource. So we just say per resource, this one must go in Europe, and we say on another resource this one must also go in Europe, and there's no guarantee that they'll both end up in the same cluster in Europe. But I think it is a requirement, to be clear.
Yeah, but it is important to point out that if the policy engine and the policy author define, for example, an annotation or a label or something like that, like a group ID or something, that the policy could enforce that proximity constraint, right? Like the existing system is flexible enough to allow both the application to specify that intent, that proximity requirement, and then the policy engine should be capable of performing that, right? When it makes the placement decision.
The proximity requirement is very interesting.
I agree.
I'm starting to wonder whether I need to sit down and spend some time rethinking like placement in general with this new information, which probably indicates that this has been a very valuable discussion, at least for me so far.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat. I think this is something that wasn't really represented in Federation V1 just because of the nature of how it was designed. And I think a lot of my thinking is sort of gated by that. So breaking down that barrier and being like, okay, well, we need to support this capability. Don't be bound by how things are currently done, but consider how they could be done if we needed to support this capability.
Yeah. I mean, I've actually given quite a lot of thought to this specific proximity requirement, and I don't think I have a write-up of it that is currently accessible to me in my current state of employment, but I could fairly trivially rewrite it up because it's quite a lot more complicated than I just spat out now.
Yeah.
And yeah, I could either give a 1-minute summary now, or I could write down a document. But in summary, you usually want kind of like a what's the right word? There's a spectrum of proximity requirements. On the one end of the spectrum, there is place me very, very close to this thing or this other set of things, like on the same node. And then on the other extreme, there is place me as far away as possible from this other thing, because I'm the backup database, so put me on a different continent kind of thing.
We're talking kind of like affinity, anti-affinity?
Yeah, I guess that there's a big overlap there. And I don't think that actually went the full way from what I recall, but I'd have to go and relook at affinity and anti-affinity, but there's certainly some overlap.
There's certainly some overlap, I was going to say, also with taints and tolerations that are applied at the node level. You can imagine having that be applied at the cluster level.
Yeah, I think taints and tolerations are kind of an implementation detail, whereas the proximity stuff is more of a user requirement thing.
So you could have this either like at the cluster level or perhaps like at a label level, right?
Yeah, so I would argue perhaps that Federation cares mostly about the cluster level, and beyond that is the job of the in-cluster scheduler to...
right, I guess I meant like, oh, I want it either in the same cluster, or I should be able to say I want it in the same continent or in the same region or something.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
But then, at a lower level, the cluster level thing might decide to put them in the same rack or a different rack or same network segment or different network segment or same node or different node, whatever.
Yeah, that's an intra-cluster consideration. I agree.
Are we done, or do we want to continue?
I am personally thinking and absorbing all of this.
Okay. We do have everyone here, and we have another 10 minutes. If we wanted to, I promised at the last meeting that I would publish the paper on labels as first-class objects, which I did last week and has gathered lots of feedback across the spectrum. We could have a quick look at that if anybody wants to, or we can push that off to next time.
I think that would be very interesting to do now, yeah.
Okay, maybe I should try and share my screen.
Quentin, I seem to recall that there's like a 3-digit or even 2-digit issue in Kubernetes about governing who can set what labels. Does that sound familiar?
So are you saying that perhaps lends credibility to my claim that it is not universally agreed as a good solution at the moment?
Oh, I mean, I can remember talking about it for years at this point.
Yeah, let me have a quick look here, see if I can share this thing. There we go. Ooh. Can anybody see my screen?
I can see it.
Yep, I can see it.
So you can just see my Chrome browser, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
I can see the document where you're writing up my durable power of attorney, but I'm cool with that.
All right, so maybe we've only got a few minutes, so I'll just shoot through it as fast as possible. Basically, one claim is that, so this came up in the context of multi-tenancy, and I think it probably is useful to us as well. And the problem can be summarized as how do you refer to groups of things in a secure way. So all the pods in a namespace or all of the nodes in a rack or whatever. And how do you do it in such a way that there is sufficient permission around that so that, for example, users who are not supposed to be able to be placed on nodes cannot, relabel nodes or relabel pods to get around the intention of whatever the policy is. So right now, the only way to label something is to have write access to that thing. And then that fact that you have write access to that thing, which might be a pod or a node or a replica set, also gives you the ability to label it with anything you want to label it with. And that may influence what label selectors it is subject to. So, for example, a controller that says, I want to consider some pod to be part of a replica set, may get confused if you label your pods with a label that is consistent with that replica set. And to some extent, namespaces kind of aim to get around this problem by saying, well, you typically only have access to stuff in your namespace, and what you do in there is your problem. But that's the general space of the problem. So the proposal that I made is that we elevate labels to first-class objects. So they're kind of disjoint from the objects that they label. So you can imagine a CRD or something called label, and you can create these labels. And you can apply RBAC rules to the labels, saying these people can read these labels and other people can write these labels, and some of the labels might be reserved, etc. And I haven't thought about it too much, but potentially they could be namespaced. And And then you have the ability to attach labels to things, and that is similarly can be R-backed. So particular roles might be able to apply certain labels to certain nodes, whereas other roles may not be able to do that. And in addition to this, labels might be substring matchable. So it would be possible to write label selectors that said, if the label value starts with tenant A, then no matter what it is, it matches that label. Whether it's a subgroup of tenant A or a subdepartment or their pods or their replica sets, like all of this policy applies to all of that stuff. Or something more specific than that, that tenant A, department B has these things applied to it, but not department C and department D. And that probably almost runs out of time. So the document describes it in a little more detail, and there's a ton of comments down the right-hand side. There's an appendix trying to kind of catalog all of the recognized challenges that people, or problems that people see with this, and perhaps try and brainstorm solutions. And there's a very, very nascent detailed use case description for places where this might be necessary and or desirable.
Do you envision filtering like the view a user has of the labels they can see based on their RBAC rules?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Gotcha.
So if tenant A or namespace A says this is like my favorite kind of node because I do my secret thing A on that node, they could create that label, and RBAC could ensure that nobody else knows that they like that node or do secret thing A on that node.
Yeah. It sounds like a valid application of that for sure. There are at least like 2 or 3 other areas that want similar things, and just full disclosure, having had people ask me for capabilities in like that in other areas, I've done some asking to the API machinery gods about it, and so far like the response that I've gotten that's actually like affected the design that we've gone with to do things like this in catalog has been that it requires pretty significant changes to the client generation and watch facilities, and that like a more readily accessible way to implement that kind of like ACL filtering is using namespaces. For me personally, like I have been told, oh, we can't do it very well right now for like quite a while. And I am hoping that right now can be over soon, since it's been for quite a while. But
yeah, so
I'll put that out there as like, like there's definitely an overlap with like 2 or 3 other things that want to do the same thing. And it seems like it's a challenge with the API machinery folks. Just full disclosure.
Yeah. I've heard similar concerns and other concerns about, oh, but namespaces are great and the current labeling scheme is great and don't change it and whatever. And I think that's totally reasonable. I haven't written it explicitly in the document, but I fully envisage that this could be implemented totally outside of core and as an optional thing. So imagine a CRD called labels and a CRD called label attachments, which has 2 pointers, one to the label and one to the thing that it's attached to. And these are totally outside of core, and all controllers and the API machinery can be completely oblivious to these things, but that it would be possible to write a controller that would be able to give you a list of pods with these secure labels attached to them, and they would have semantics which are more strong and well-defined than the current labeling or namespace scheme, and more flexible. So that's sort of the broad approach that I would be inclined to take to get around all of these concerns from API machinery and otherwise. Make sense?
Yeah, I also think that, like, I've heard enough different areas that could really use the ACL filtering on list and watch to feel like we should solve it generally. And I am aware of one implementation that solves at least some of these concerns called OpenShift projects, where a project basically is an alias for a namespace, but users can have access to multiple projects and should only be able to see the ones that they have access to. And I believe that there is a repo that contains an implementation of that concept as distinct from the rest of OpenShift, in the hopes that we would be able to upstream projects. And that sounds like a promising place to look for an implementation that does that. And I would hope that whatever, and just for the record, the same people that have told me it's very difficult to do this are the people that created the project thing. So I'm hoping that maybe there's something out there that contains elements of a general solution. But I think you're right. I think there could be other ways around that, and that I'm getting to the point where I have so many people asking me for a way to do this that if there's not an easy way to modify the API machinery to do it, I think we should figure out another easy way that can be like a temporary hedge.
Yeah. Is the API machinery challenge, is that related to the fact that you can list things that you don't have read access on?
Well, so I think that's part of it. One thing that seems to be entangled with it is watch semantics. Like, if you have an ACL that gives you access to read, let's call it like instance X of resource Y, and then you do a watch on resource Y, or I'm sorry, you do a watch on resource Y, and you get events for instance X of that resource, and then your ACL changes so that you no longer have access to it. What happens? Do you just stop getting watch events? Like, do you?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, that seems like a smaller problem to me. But yeah, I understand. I mean, watches terminate anyway. Like, as soon as your connection,
Right.
you've got to recreate
Yeah.
the watch, and presumably at that time you would fail because you don't have read access. So I don't see that as a major problem. But I think we're kind of out of time. So what I can briefly implore you all to do is, if you think this is a good idea, please vocally state so on the document, because otherwise it will be drowned out in people who are saying that it is not a good idea. So don't just say that to me, put it in the document and say, I think this is a very worthwhile thing to think about, or the words you used, Paul. I'd appreciate that very much.
Okay, thanks for sharing, Quentin.
Cool. I guess
Yeah,
we'll see you
just-
guys on Wednesday.
Just before we, any expectations from Wednesday? I see that our discussion around the placement is unfinished. So do we continue the same, or?
I think I was going to put together something explaining proximity requirements, and people were going to think about things related to proximity requirements. I think that was the only to-do that I can recall.
Yeah, I personally need to do some thinking after this conversation and incorporate this new information into my understanding of the problem space.
Okay.
So I guess one question, and I know we're a little over, I'll pose this now and I'll start an email thread about it so that we can discuss it there. Should we continue having this meeting on Monday? I think it's useful to get as much bandwidth as we can. We have Federation working group on Wednesday, and then we have every other week the Tuesday multi-cluster meeting. Should we have another Monday meeting next week? And maybe we can talk about that on Wednesday.
I think we can talk about that on Wednesday. And I think Monday was like one-off thing because of such unfinished discussions as today.
Okay.
At
Cool.
least logical closure was not there in the discussions.
That makes sense.
Okay, so see you on Wednesday then.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a
Yeah.
good day.